Creating dynamic named ranges with the offset function is super popular, but I don't think it's the best function for the task. And that's because offset is a volatile function, which means it recalculates even if none of its arguments have changed, leading to more frequent updates and potential performance issues. So if your files are slow, offset could be the culprit. Instead, I use the index function for my dynamic named ranges, well, most of the time. In this video, we'll look at how to create dynamic named ranges that automatically update when you add new data, so you never have to edit a cell reference again, and dynamic named ranges that enable you to choose a different range based on a selection you make in a drop-down list. We'll look at creating them with both index and offset. I'll also show you the tricks required to use dynamic named ranges in charts. It's not obvious. And we'll look at common reasons your dynamic named range returns the wrong range. So stay tuned till the end. We'll start with writing dynamic named ranges with the index function. Now most people know index for returning a value based on a match, but index actually returns a reference to a cell or a range. Index has two syntax options, and for dynamic named ranges we use this version. The array is the range of cells you want to return a range from. Row num is the row or rows you want to return. Column num is the column or columns that you want to return. I'll be using this data in the examples, and the first example I want to cover returns the range to the whole table. You might use this for the source data for a pivot table, which means you'll also want to return the header row. Now over time, this table could have more rows and more columns added, so we need to allow for that. Now I like to write my dynamic named range formulas in a cell in the grid because it's easy to use the mouse to select the cell ranges. The first cell in the range is always going to be the top left cell of the table, and I want to make sure that that's an absolute reference, so we'll F4 that. Now if you don't need the header row in the range, start at the next row down. Next I need the range operator, which is the colon, and I'm going to use index to find the last cell in the table. So selecting the whole table again, I'm also going to select some empty rows to allow for growth down and some columns to allow for growth in the years. I'm going to F4 to absolute that. Next I'll use count A to find the number of rows. So I want to count the category column right down to row 16. So I'm allowing for growth and I'm making sure that the range I'm counting is the same size as the range I'm indexing. F4 to absolute the reference. And then for the column number, again, we're going to use count A. This time, we're counting the header row to see how many column labels we have. Again, matching the size of the range being indexed. F4 to absolute, close parentheses on count A, close parentheses on index. Now, if you have Excel 2021 or later, or Microsoft 365, your formulas will spill the results to the grid, which also makes it super easy to check that the formula evaluates correctly. However, if you have Excel 2019 or earlier, you'll get an error at this point. But don't worry, that's to be expected because your version of Excel can't spill the results. You can still check the formula evaluates correctly once you've set up the defined name. So let's do that. To create a dynamic named range, copy the formula from the formula bar, and then on the Formulas tab, define name. I'm going to call this range index flex, because it's got an overall flexible size. And then in the refers to, we'll delete what's already there and we'll Control V to paste in the formula that we created. I'll click OK. Now I can reference that formula in a name. So let's say we want to count the number of cells in that range. There's my defined formula name. I can use the IntelliSense to select it, or I can use this shortcut key F3 to bring up the list of names, and then I can choose it from the list. Close parentheses, we can see the range being referenced with the blue highlight, press enter, and we get the result, which is 25. Now if we evaluate that formula, you can see that it returns a range. And if we look in the name manager and we select it from the list here and then click in the refers to, you can see the marching ants highlight the range that's currently being returned by that formula. And as you add more data, you can see the range returned automatically grows to include it. Sometimes you only need one row returned. It could be based on a selection in a data validation list or another cell for use in a chart, table, or a formula. The formula for returning a range for a specific row uses index and match on both sides of the colon range operator. Now, if you're not familiar with index and match, there's a link to a tutorial in the video description that'll get you up to speed in 4 minutes. So to write this formula, we're going to start with index, and the first cell I want returned is in the first value column of the table. So starting with the header and allowing for growth, we're going to F4 to absolute, then I'll use match to find the row that I've got selected in the data validation list here, F4 to absolute. In the lookup array is the category column, again allowing for growth, and I want an exact match, which is 0, close parentheses on match, and then the column number, well, I've only indexed one column, so I technically could omit the column number argument, or I can enter 1 for completeness. So this is going to give me the first cell in my range, and then colon range operator, and we'll go for index again to find the last cell in the range. So here I'm indexing from the first value column down to row 16 to allow for growth, and out to column L, also allowing for growth. F4 to absolute, and then we're going to use match again to look up the value selected in the data validation list in the category column, F4 to absolute, and we want an exact match, close match, and then for the column number we can simply count how many column labels we have in the table, again allowing for growth, out to the same column that our index array is referencing, F4 to absolute, close parentheses on count A, close parentheses on index, press enter, and the result spills. Again, if you have Excel 2019 or earlier, your results won't spill, you'll get an error here. But you can wrap the formula in sum, and you'll see I've already given this formula a name. We can see it's range index row. If I change the item selected in the category data validation list, it updates accordingly. Now, if we want to check how the name is being evaluated, we can go into the name manager, choose it from the list, click in the refers to, and you can see currently it's evaluating to return the values for components because I've got components selected in the data validation list. And if we evaluate the formula, we can see the range being returned there. Similarly, we can use index to return a specific column based on a selection made in a data validation list. Again, we use index and match on both sides of the colon range operator. Let's go ahead and build the formula. So index, this time we're indexing the first row of the table because that's going to be the starting cell, at least in the first row. We'll allow for growth out to column L, F4 to absolute. The row number, well, there's only one row selected. I can put 1 in here or I can skip it. And then the column number, we're going to use match to look up the year here, F4 to absolute, in the row containing the year labels, F4 to absolute, and I want an exact match, close match, close index. So that's going to give me the starting cell. It's going to be one of the cells in row 9, and then colon for the range operator, and index to find the last cell. So the last cell is going to be somewhere in this range here, allowing for growth out to column L and row 16, F4 to absolute. The height of this range must match the height of the index range, and it shouldn't contain any empty cells. So I'm going to count the category labels down to row 16, F4 to absolute. And for the column that I want returned, well, that depends on the year selected in this cell here. So let's use match to find the column for which year is selected, allowing for growth, and we want an exact match. Close match, close index, press enter, and we get the results for 2020. If I select a different year, it automatically updates accordingly. Again, I've already defined a name for this formula, and if we look in the name manager and click in the refers to, we can see it's currently returning 2023's data. Likewise, if we evaluate it, we can see the range being returned. Now, this type of dynamic named range is also handy for use in lookup formulas and SUMIFs and the like. Dynamic name ranges are incredibly flexible, and with flexibility often comes complexity. So to summarize the key points, for dynamic name ranges that you expect to grow, index a range larger than the current data size and use count A in the row num and column num arguments. For dynamic name ranges linked to data validation lists or other cells where the user can specify what they want returned, use match in the row num and column num arguments. If the start and end of the range needs to be flexible, use index on both sides of the colon range operator. And ensure that all cell references are absolute before creating the defined name. There are exceptions to this, which I cover in my relative named range tutorial linked to in the video description. Okay, let's look at creating these same dynamic name ranges with offset. The syntax for offset is reference. This is the starting cell or range of cells. And then rows, which is the number of rows you want to move up or down from the starting cell to arrive at the first row in the range. And then cols, which is the number of columns to move left or right from the starting cell to arrive at the first column in the range. And then we have the height, which is the number of rows high you want the range to be, and the width, which is the number of columns wide you want the range to be. We'll start with a range that returns a reference to the whole table, allowing for growth. So we want offset, and our reference is going to be the very top left cell in the table, F4 to absolute. The next argument is how many rows from there do we want to move down before we start the range? Well, no rows, so I'm going to skip that argument. How many columns do we want to move left or right from the starting point before starting the range? Well, none again, so we're going to skip that one. And then the height, well, we can use count A to count the items in the row labels, allowing for growth down to row 16 and F4 to absolute. And then how wide is this table going to be? Well, I don't know. Let's count how many column labels we have. Again, allowing for growth, we'll just go to column J. F4 to absolute, close count A, close offset, and the results spill. And just like with index, as I add data to the table, offset will grow the range to accommodate that new data. Returning a specific row that's based on a selection in a data validation list or another cell for use in a chart, table, or a formula is also doable with offset and match. Let's take a look. So I'll start with offset, and the reference is going to be the first year label, and that's because in the next argument I'm going to use match to find which row clothing is on in the table, and that means that the reference is going to move at least one cell down from the starting point. So I'm going to F4 to absolute that. The number of rows, well, this is where we use match to look up clothing, F4 to absolute, in this range here, allowing for growth, and I want an exact match. So that's going to tell me which row clothing is on. Next, we need the number of columns I want to move. Well, I don't want to move any columns across from the reference point, so we're going to skip that argument. The height, it's only going to be one row high, so I can skip that. And then the width, well, that will depend how many years of data I have. So let's allow for growth out to column J, F4 to absolute, close count A, close offset, and that gives me the results for clothing. And if I change the option in the category drop down, I get the data accordingly. Similarly, we can use offset to return a specific column based on a selection made in the data validation list. Again, we use offset with match to find the relevant column, and then count A to determine the height of the range. So let's go ahead and take a look. So we'll start with offset. The reference point is going to be the first row of the category labels, and that's because I'm going to use match to find which column to return. That's going to require moving at least one cell across from the reference point, so we need to start one cell to the left of where we could potentially be starting our range. And then the number of rows down, I don't want to move any rows down, so we're going to skip that argument. Then we're going to use match to look up what column the year selected in the data validation is in this range here, allowing for growth, and we want an exact match. Close match. That's going to give us how many columns we're moving across from the reference point. The height's going to be determined by a count, and we don't know how many rows we're going to have eventually. We're going to allow for growth down to row 16. I'm counting the category column because that's unlikely to have any blanks. That's going to return the correct count. We'll absolute reference that, close parentheses on count. And then for the width, well, only one column is going to be returned, so we can skip that argument, close parentheses on offset, and press enter, and we get the results for 2021. If I change the year it updates accordingly. One of the best uses for dynamic name ranges is as the source for charts, enabling the charts to automatically update as the data grows. Now, the trick with charts is that they require a separate name for each series and the axis labels. So let's start by inserting a chart for this data. I'll just put a line chart in. I'll bring it up here. I need to just edit this so that the row and column labels are switched around. I also don't need the category label as a series, and we'll leave it at that. Okay, so I need a dynamic named range for the axis labels and for each series in the chart. Let's start with the axis labels. The starting cell will always be this one here. That's F4 to absolute. And then we'll use index to find the last cell in the column labels. So I'm going to index this and we'll allow for growth out to column J, F4 to absolute. The row number, we can skip that argument, there's only one row. The column number, that will depend how many column labels we have. Again, out to column J, matching the array being indexed. Close parentheses on count and close index. That gives us the row labels. Let's quickly define this as a name. We'll call this chart axis, and I'll paste it in the refers to. So that's the chart axis done. Let's just edit this formula for the first series, which is accessories, and then I'll copy that and we'll define another name. This will be range accessories, and we'll paste it in the refers to. Okay, so now we have our first two defined names for the chart. Let's go and edit the chart to use the defined names. We'll start with the axis label, so I'll edit that. At the moment it hasn't got any label. Now, for charts to use dynamic named ranges, it must be prefixed with the sheet name, and the easiest way to add that in is just to select any odd cell in the sheet, delete everything up to the exclamation mark, and then I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut F3 to bring up the list of names. There's my chart axis name. I'm going to double click to use it. Click OK, and we can see the chart in the background is now using the correct axis labels. Let's do the same for accessories. So I'm going to edit this. The series name can stay as it is, but I want to replace the series values with the dynamic name range I created for accessories. Click OK and OK. So the chart doesn't look a lot different aside from the axis labels, but if I add new data for 2024, we'll see that the accessories range will grow because it's dynamic, but the others haven't been set up yet. So I'll leave you to do that for homework. You can practice, go and set up the dynamic named ranges for the other series in the chart. The three most common causes of errors with dynamic name ranges are, firstly, erroneous data entered in the cells being counted for the height or width. If you inadvertently enter some data below or to the right of your table in the rows or columns being counted, you'll end up with a range larger than it should be. The easiest way to check the range being returned by a dynamic named range is to go into the name manager and click in the refers to. You can see it's now including an extra row, and that's because I have some text in row 15 in column B, which is being counted for the height of that range. So I need to delete that data, and then I get the correct range returned. Blank cells being counted for the height or width are the next most common issue. Here, if I delete one of the categories, you can see we now get one less row of data, and we've also got a missing category label. We can see this in the name manager. Again, clicking in the refers to, you can see the range is one row short. So make sure that the column and row labels that you're counting don't contain any blanks. Typically, your row labels and column labels are safe bets. And lastly, forgetting to absolute reference the ranges being referenced in your formula will result in erroneous dynamic named ranges. So far we've looked at dynamic name ranges that, when referenced from anywhere in the workbook, always return the same range. We achieve this by setting all the references in the formulas as absolute. However, we can also write relative named ranges that return a range relative to the cell in which you refer to it from, and they're particularly handy for sparklines. For more, see my relative named ranges tutorial linked to in the video description. You've probably gathered by now that dynamic named ranges are quite a lot of work to set up. It's far easier to store your data in an Excel table and use the built-in structured references. that work like a dynamic named range. As you add data, the table automatically grows, and those results are automatically included in any formulas or pivot tables or charts that reference those tables. Check out the link in the video description to my tables video. I hope you found this tutorial useful. You can download the example file from the link here, and if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more. And why not share it with your friends who might also find it useful. Thanks for watching.